Scanning for audio.
Welcome once again to the Tin Dog Podcast. It seems like an absolute age since I've done a proper show. This week we're going to be talking about Full Circle. Full Circle is the first part of the eSpace trilogy, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. But as always, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping before we move on. I know I don't normally do news, but there is something that caught my eye which I thought was quite funny. Apparently you could do online betting to see who would be the 11th Doctor. Now, we've all covered over who's going to be the 11th Doctor now, but rather oddly, on the last day, the online betting people had Matt go from 100 to 1, right down to 3 to 1, right up to favourite, and all of the bets that made that strange thing happen took place in Matt's hometown. Now, obviously, according to the Doctor Who Confidential, the only person that Matt had told was his father. Now, whether Matt's father told anyone else, that's perfectly reasonable conjecture, but it is odd to note that a lot of bets suddenly went on just before he was announced. Who am I to talk about such things? I would have put some money on myself if I'd known he was in the running at all. Of course, I didn't know he was in the running at all. A younger Doctor? Stephen Moffat promised us an older one. Who cares? As long as the guy can act, I'll be very happy. You may have noticed that I've been away a little bit. Well, that's because I've been doing some co-hosting duties on the WhoCast. So thanks to Trevor and Paul for organising that. And I will pop along back to the WhoCast at various points to help out whenever needed. A bit like Arthur. No, not quite like Arthur. Rising in order to help out whenever needed. Thanks also, which is something I forgot to mention last time, to Tony Galachon for, well, let's put it this way, he bolted together the version of the WhoCast theme tune that I played in the last show, so thanks for Tony. And as always, still try and get well soon. You may notice a slight difference in sound quality. That's because I'm trying to run in a new mic. I hope it's good, I hope it's better, and I hope it's good enough. The new mic was only possible thanks to donations received, and I'll be thanking people specifically later on in other shows. But either way, thanks for everyone who's given recently, because without those, I wouldn't have this sound quality. This year, and by the way, Happy New Year. This year being 2009, I've decided to set myself a challenge to experience every Doctor Who story that I can. That's the official BBC ones. Obviously, I'm always going to partake in the Big Finish end of things, but I've already had every single one of those and I've listened to them all. But I realised I couldn't really call myself a true Doctor Who fan unless I was dealing with, well, the original stories. I was looking at my collection, trying to bring everything together, and I realised there were some holes in it. And not just where the BBC had, well, deleted their stories. I'd never seen The Keys of Marinus. I'd never seen Planet of the Giants. And these things are wrong. So I've set about tracking them down on VHS, the last 4 or 5 stories that I'd never seen. And I've also set about getting hold of all of the BBC audio CDs, the recreations of the stories, so that I, very soon, will be talking about Doctor Who that's been missing. In a few weeks' time I'll be talking about the Macra Terror, one I've already experienced, and I must admit I truly enjoyed a bit of Troughton. It's great to know that every single Doctor Who story ever made by the BBC exists in some form or another, and so I'm looking forward to covering those in this droughty year of 2009, as well as various other things. But enough nonsense, it's time for Full Circle.
Citizens, as first decider and keeper of the system files, I must announce to you the coming of Mistfall. There is no need to be alarmed, as long as you all follow the procedure.
Towards the end of Tom Baker's time as the Doctor, things were becoming a little bit strained at the BBC. To all intents and purposes, Tom was now the Doctor, something he'd be difficult to shake off for the next 20-odd years. In fact, the show would also have trouble shaking this off. He'd spent 6-7 years in the role. The production crew were also having a bit of trouble dealing with Tom. And so when JNT took over, he elected, rather oddly, or indeed politically, not to offer Tom an incremental pay rise. So when Tom threatened to resign, rather than go, "Oh no, we'll offer you more cash," the production crew went, "All right then, bye." And thus the Fifth Doctor's time began. And so this last series with Tom in it was a little bit strained. So it's no surprise that when the DVD comes out of Full Circle, there's very little extras with Tom on it. It's full of Romana, it's full of K9, it's full of Adric, it's got Matt Irvine on it. Many things that I find great in DVD Extra Land. But an absence of Tom is noticeable. However, Tom's performance in the stories is never less than 100%, at least from an audience's point of view. The basic plot of Full Circle exists within a larger, well, let's call it a story arc, that's what they're called these days, called the E-Space Trilogy. E-Space, or Exospace, exists outside or alongside our own reality. It's basically a type of parallel universe. And so at the very beginning of this story, the TARDIS slides into this E-Space. It's where all 3 stories take place, hence the box set. E-Space is considerably smaller than our universe, and appears for some very, very odd reason to be green. And of course, like the song says, it's not easy being green. The TARDIS itself was on the way to Gallifrey to drop off Romana.
You ready, K9?
That's it.
Right. I want you to set a course of binary coordinates 10-0-11-0-0 by 02 from Galactic Zero Center.
Coordinates lit in.
Very good.
Spatial drive initiated.
Well done, K9. Well, now we've dropped off our Earth friend, we can be on our way.
You've made up your mind, then?
Oh, yes, we can't resist a summons to Gallifrey. Anyway, I'm so looking forward to seeing how Leela and Andred are getting on.
Time Lords want me back.
Yes. Well, you only came to help with the key to time.
Doctor, I don't want to spend the rest of my life on Gallifrey. After all this.
Well, you can't fight Time Lords, Romana.
You did. Once.
And lost.
She didn't want to go back, but the Gallifreyans had apparently commanded it, although you never truly saw it. As we all know, Romana was on board in the first place to find the key to time, and she'd stuck with the Doctor through her second regeneration. At this point, and I'm sure it's alright to talk about such things, the actress Lalla Ward, who played Romana, was having some sort of relationship with Tom, a relationship that ended up with, I think, a 6-month-long marriage after Tom had left the series. However, during rehearsals, they hardly spoke to each other or indeed talked to each other. Again, another reason why Tom doesn't really have much to do with these DVD extras. I think spending time with your ex-wife can be less than fun, even if you're being paid for it. And so the TARDIS travels through the E-Space doorway to a planet it thinks it's Gallifrey and lands, and on the scanner it's Gallifrey, and then when you open the door, it's the New Forest. Or at least a planet called Alzarius. Yeah, the BBC do a lovely line in Strange Alien Worlds that look just a little bit like a forest. But that's fine. Now that I come to think about it, Alzarius, the planet that exists in exactly the same spatial coordinates as Gallifrey, would be an ideal place for Gallifrey to have vanished to in the new series if anyone's ever looking for an excuse for Gallifrey to have survived. Yeah, well, you know, we all think in our heart of hearts that Gallifrey may or may not have survived. Oh, who am I crying a kid? We're all fans. We all want it to have survived. But the writers, I don't think, will let it. Oh, look, I've rambled. How marvellous. On this planet, Alzarius, we're presented with a very small community. A community of, apparently, some survivors from a great crash from some sort of spaceship. A space liner of some sort. The descendants are constantly checking and rechecking the spaceship, preparing for the great day of the great embarkation, where the spaceship will take off and leave. They also live in fear of the locals, the Marshmen who live in the swamps. They eat things called river fruit. It's a nice microcosm of a universe. Of course, that's the setup. The story's actually about things like evolution and challenging people's elders and what you take to be truth versus what you can see to be truth. And it's the origin of this story that at its core really, really should intrigue us. You see, it's written by someone called Andrew Smith, someone you may not be familiar with. It's his only part of the Doctor Who canon. And these days, Andrew is now a very high-ranking policeman. But in these days, back in 1980, he was 17. He was a Doctor Who fan, and he was writing the story. He was the fan we always want to be, the person who actually partakes in the production process. Now I know the BBC's open door policy of the 70s and 80s really would never exist these days, and in fact on the BBC website there's a big sign saying please do not send us ideas for stories because we'll just destroy them without reading them to avoid some sort of copyright thing. But in the 70s, people were sending in ideas for stories all left, right and centre. People saying, please can I just write for you? And Andrew was very, very persistent. He'd sent ideas into Anthony Reid, and eventually, via Douglas Adams, who had bought him his first alcoholic drink. Now I must admit, how cool is that? The first person to buy you a pint is Douglas Adams. That's possibly the best claim to fame known to man. And that storyline, sadly, was rejected. But he kept going. He kept banging away at the BBC's door, trying to get a Doctor Who made. Small sketches for Not the 9 O'Clock News and lots of other shows allowed him just to inch that door open, and so that when the new ethos of Doctor Who, getting away from the fantasy and the horror and more into the pure sci-fi that this series definitely represents, came about, then The Planet That Sleeps, which was the original storyline, was dug out from the slush pile, and breath was given back to it. New life. A chance was definitely taken on a 17-year-old, and for me this story works very, very well. I know it's not everybody's favourite. It's not everybody's favourite for one star-wearing reason, but we'll get back to Adric later. In fact, no. Let's deal with the pointy problem of Adric straight off.
Well, of course I'm better than you.
You see, I still don't know why people don't like Adric. My boss at work was at university during Earthshock, and he told me the story of how him and his friends cheered and had an extra drink the night that Adric was written out. Well, in my book that kind of makes you a Doctor Who fan, if you're willing to retell a story like that. But more importantly, it illustrates that Adric, and for many people K9, were really disliked by fandom.
I saw a blue box.
If you've got two so-called assistants, one might be more useful than the other, but who's to argue that point? You can divide the plot in other ways, and in some way that could be a good thing. In other ways it could sort of dissipate a story more than might be good. It's a question of how cleverly it's used. It doesn't have to be a bad idea. I mean, I think it would have been a wonderful idea if Adric could have, say, taken the plot over the edge of a cliff and never come back, but they didn't see it that way, so he's stuck like a burr.
I was slightly younger, and I really didn't have a problem with Adric, especially at the time. A friend of mine at school had a small badge. Admittedly, it had nothing to do with Doctor Who. It was from the brewery, Scottish in Newcastle, whose logo at the time and indeed today is a small blue star. And he had, basically, as far as I was concerned, the little badge of mathematical excellence. It was smaller, it wasn't quite official, but to me it was still fab, and I really, really wanted one. I know Adric was invented as a character to be either a mathematical genius or an artful dodger in space, and various people seem to have grasped various aspects of that and ran with it, and some writers just didn't know what to do with Adric at all, so perhaps some of the writing made Adric's character suffer. The fact that the guy playing Adric, Matthew Waterhouse, seems to have been, how can I put this, precocious. Various stories told about him at conventions seem to back this up, but as I've not met him at a convention and all I've seen are some interviews, again, I've got no real issues. So if you know why you don't like Adric, send me an email at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk. Another thing that this plot has, at its very core, is the theory of evolution. Again, this is getting back to the pure hard sci-fi aspects that Doctor Who was trying to aim for. Now obviously evolution and this particular story, well, this particular cast, has a very specific point. You see, Lalla Ward, who played Romana, is actually married to Richard Dawkins, the rather intense evolutionary biologist. I say intense because I have issues with Dawkins, not the theory of evolution at all, because of something that was on TV a few months ago. There was a documentary about Darwin, apparently on Channel 4, hosted by Dawkins, and I was thinking, great, I'm going to find out all about Darwin the man, the way that his theories were engendered, the way that the classic underachiever that was Darwin eventually came up with ideas and concepts that could change, and indeed have changed, the rest of human history. What I got instead was just the same points being made again and again and again, and it was like he was preaching to the choir, pun definitely intended. Perhaps it was just me missing the point, but I'm not a huge fan of Dawkins because he's just so intense about his hatred of anyone who has an invisible friend. But either way, Lalla loves him and Lalla lives with him, and again they were introduced by Douglas Adams.
The whole sort of evolution thing, obviously I'm rather interested in now that I got my grounding in Doctor Who. Doesn't really show that I did it in a particularly sensible way, but I've since learned a great deal about it.
It's worthy to note that last week on Radio 4, this is in England, and available as a podcast to download, I was given the Darwin story. Thanks to Melvyn Bragg's series In Our Time, 4 one-hour specials were broadcast, and they filled in all of the holes and all of the questions that I had in mind in the first place. That could be described as a ramble, except that in this story evolution is a major, major part of the plot. Without wanting to be spoilerific, the origin of the apparent crew of the Starliner isn't all it seems to be, and everyone seems to be in denial. Denial of what may or may not be known, denial of their own origins, and whether these are plot points or indeed holes in the plot, that's for really each and every viewer to make up their own mind. As one of the major characters on board the ship itself is run by a group of people called the Deciders.
I am Nefred.
I am Gareth. I am Logan. And I'm the Doctor.
The main character is George Baker. Now, George Baker for me will always be either Inspector Wexford, as he will be to most people, but more importantly, he was an actor to play one of the number 2s in the TV series The Prisoner. And as you know, I always sign off every podcast with "Be seeing you," which is of course what people say in The Village in The Prisoner. I know it's a bit annoying sometimes because obviously I'm not actually going to be seeing you, you'll be hearing me. But let's not get pedantic, shall we? It's only a podcast. George puts in a fantastic performance in this show. If anything, he takes a small character and expands it, fills it, lives it, and gives us something that we've really come to expect from modern Who. True characterization. At the end of this story, Adric stows away on the TARDIS, leading directly into the second part of the trilogy and of course the third. And is this story any good? It's not bad. Admittedly, it's showing its age, and it always feels odd watching a Tom Baker story, but with the music you associate with Peter Davison. But that's just a personal thing, and indeed it's not important. What is important is that this trilogy starts with a very strong story, that even the artificial spiders aren't as bad as they could have been, and that overarching themes like vivisection or the origin of your own species or being true to yourself are all dealt with in an accessible fashion. So what else do you get on this disc? Well, on this disc, and remember this is one of 3, you get of course a commentary, and now that one's by Andrew Smith and Christopher H. Bymead. Or was it Bidmead? Either way, it's Christopher H. And Matthew Waterhouse. You get a lovely making-of documentary called All Aboard the Starliner, which of course is a play on words of All Aboard the Skylark, which was a kids' series, and yeah, let's not even go down that road. A very nice little sort of side documentary, pure science, which is e-space, fact or fiction. And rounding off this first disc is multicoloured swap shop interviewing Matthew Waterhouse. Which brings me to the end of this long-awaited Tin Dog podcast. Next time I'll be doing part 2 of the e-space trilogy, State of Decay, where Tom Baker, of course, deals with rather fangy friends. Before I go, I'd like to play some music. Now, normally I play something from the Whomix website, but as it hasn't been updated for 6 months, and does anyone actually know what's happened to the Whomix site? And if you do know, could you email me? Then I could make an announcement of some sort, because it's such a great site, and I can't believe that everyone's just suddenly stopped doing versions of the Doctor Who theme tune. In fact, if you do versions of the Doctor Who theme tune and you'd like me to put them on at the end of a Tin Dog podcast, just email me a link and I'll have a listen. And so this time I'm going to try something a little bit different. Something, yes, admittedly a bit steampunky, but not quite. It's just a track that's had over 500,000 hits on YouTube. Cup of Brown Joy. It's by MC Elemental, and it's from the album Rebel Without Applause. Look, I won't tell you how great it is. Just have a listen.
Love a cup. I would... Oh, God, yes. Oh, that is gorgeous. I need a cup of the brown stuff, the shade of an acorn, made warm by the same source that I take my cakes from. Using a teapot, a mug or fine china, been hooked up to IVs, need constant supplies, and a drip for my urges might verge on perverted. But for earthy brown tea, I'm certain it's worth it. With Sherpas who work hers and use a fresh fountain, I've discerned brews from Peruvian mountains. I've slurped up a cup from an elephant's trunk, with a couple of monks who utterly stunk. I've had bourbons with sultans and creams with queens, and I've bathed in Earl Grey. I'm really that keen, and missionaries dismissed me for my single epiphany. The dip between him and me is a simple sip of British tea. So when times are hard and life is rough, you can stick the kettle on and find me a cup. Now when I say Earl Grey, you say yes please, Earl Grey. Yes please, Earl Grey. Yes please. When I say Assam, you say lovely, Assam. Lovely, Assam. Lovely. When I say ooh, you say ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah. Oh, God, an opera. I've been around the world in 80 brews to see the place it takes me to make a brew that tastes like the cream cakes made by angels do. I'm not the same as you, get shaky but aim to swig amazing fluids but don't make it the same. Now using fine leaves picked by pretty maidens in a bag knitted by a seamstress who lives in Copenhagen, brewed up in a pot made of semi-precious metal, let the blessed content settle in my very special kettle. Now when I say ooh, you say long, ooh, long, ooh, long. When I say herbal, you say no thanks, herbal, no thanks, herbal, no thanks. No, I want milk in it. Strong though. I want to see that spoon stand up. If you're tired of tea, then you're tired of life. I'm madder than a hatter, and it fires my mic. Liken me to Earl Grey, Assam or ginger, lapsang, souchon, raise my pinky finger. Keep your sodding coffee in a proper cup of coffee pot and spot me lobbing teapot to your poncy rotten coffee shop. Coffee clots nodding off, lost the plot, sodding off. Need some caffeine tannin and a Battenberg to top it off. Cut them off a different cloth, a different lot can take their beer on 80 cups a day. I haven't slept for 80 years. You could say I'm mad for tea or just say I'm mad. Oh, you can't stay any longer. Oh, actually, I'm quite glad. All the more Battenberg for me. I can barely pour, my hands got a bit shaky from caffeine. Oh, love it though. I'd sell my own grandma. Well, I'd sell your grandma.
And with that, I'll bid you farewell. Until next time, be seeing you. You have been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. Doctor Who and its associated shows are all trademark of the BBC. No infringement is intended. Contact us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk.